Cole, so excited to talk to you today, especially about this topic. This is something that I've had so many questions about, and I don't know how to answer them. So I'm hoping to put those questions to you. And as a much more experienced leader in the people analytics field, I'm really excited for you to be able to answer those questions. And so
I'll just kick them right back to you, Chris. I'm just gonna deflect.
So I'm gonna do a quick introduction and then give you a couple of minutes to say hi to everyone. I think most of the people that are attending are probably from your reposting of this link anyway. So I'm sure everyone knows you a lot better than they know me. But you're the star of the show. So here we go. So Cole, you and I met through the Work Tech Accelerator. George Larock was very gracious to invite me to jump in that accelerator and learn a ton throughout the process. And one of the things that I learned was that I should be listening to your podcast a lot more than I was previously. Directionally Correct, for anyone that isn't already a subscriber, I'm sure many people that are attending this are. But one of the things that I noticed a few weeks ago was you really highlighted this one key metric that I've been struggling with for many years, the quality of hire metric. And so really excited to jump into the discussion today with you. Before we do, I want to give you 2 minutes to introduce yourself to anyone that doesn't already know who you are. Also plug where they can find more information about all the great work you're doing with the podcast and then with Orgnostic as well.
Absolutely. Well, I appreciate you giving a plug to Impact Work Tech as well. George is doing really great work over there. I love being affiliated with that organization. But my current role is I am the Vice President of People Analytics and Product Evangelist for a people analytics platform called Orgnostic. If you're not familiar with them, you should be. We're doing really, really innovative work. I'm also the co-host and owner of Directionally Correct, a people analytics podcast. And I write articles through that. And that's where the article that we're going to discuss today came from on the same title, Directionally Correct, a people analytics Substack. So great way to find me. Chris is being way too self-effacing. He's well known in people analytics as well. You should be listening to his stuff also. He's been writing really great content now for the last few months. So I appreciate what you're doing, Chris.
That's very kind of you to say. All right, so let's jump straight into it then. So quality of hire, the definition. Now, you said that the definition is probably not as relevant as some of the other things, but on the spot, gun to your head, how would you define quality of hire to someone in a bar?
Yeah, well, but actually, before we do that, can I take a step back for a moment? I want to kick it to you as well. Of like, why is this relevant right now? Because I've been talking and writing, and I think I presented at PSYOP probably 10 years ago on quality of hire. I mean, it's been a while, and it has never had traction until this current moment. I write an article, presumably I thought was just for a bunch of analysts who are, pushing spreadsheets around on paper, and it became quite popular. And I was like, what is going on here? This is stuff I've been saying forever. Why is it getting traction in this current moment? So I would love to get your perspective on this, Chris, because I know you've been doing a lot of writing on quality of hire, and then maybe we can define what it is after that. But why now?
Yeah, I think if I was to really kind of cycle back to when I first moved to recruiting in 2018, my kind of one goal and that was set by the person that hired me to lead a recruiting team was to fill roles as quickly as possible. Like, we can never hire enough people. I heard one CEO of a different company, one of our advisors, say their CFO would always target more hires than they needed could fill because the recruiting team would never be able to fill all the roles. And so, they may as well be aggressive in their hiring. And that was the case in 2018, 2019, 2020, maybe not so much, but actually the latter half of the year did start to kick off again, all the way through till summer 2022. And then all of a sudden, I think everyone realized, hey, we've hired too many people and maybe we've let the bar slip. A lot of people are leaving. We had the great resignation in the last couple of years. And so I think that based on the conversations I've been having over the last 12 months with CHROs and heads of TA, it seems like the focus is less on let's hire as many people as possible and when can I get my next hire filled to let's take a step back and make sure that we hired the right person. They're not going to leave in 6 months and that they are going to perform and stay with the company and really grow into the role. And so I think the perspective shifted As an analyst, I don't have any data to support that,
Sure.
aside from all the qualitative interviews we've done over the last 12 months. Curious, Cole, if you've seen or heard the same things, and any of the data you could maybe share from Orgnostic as well.
No, I absolutely think about what you're saying is correct. And it's because of this moment. I guess I take issue with it. I they should have been caring about quality of hire even when they had the audacious hiring plans. And the reason is pretty self-evident that if you have really the issue, if I boil it down to its lowest level, if we did like a 5 whys exercise, it would get down to, do functions like executives or finance, do they treat employees as interchangeable units? You take out one unit and you replace it with another unit that's a clone, that's identical, that performs in all the same ways? Or are human beings fundamentally different and bring unique skill sets to the table? I think the premise of my background in people analytics and IO psychology would state the second, which is people are not interchangeable units. And if you treat them as such, you're going to be astounded by the consequences of having done so. And you're always going to be flabbergasted. Why aren't things working the way I thought they would work? I removed one unit and I replaced it with another unit. Why isn't it working the same way? And things just don't work that way. And so get back to the kind of the definition of quality of hire, no one defines things as quantity of hire. I've never heard someone say that. So for some reason, we talk about the quality of hire definition. Well, why are we not talking about the quantity of hire definition? Because everyone seems to focus on that. We have a hiring plan. We're trying to meet the plan. Apparently, the people you've worked with in the past said, we're going to put more people in the plan because recruiting is never going to be able to meet the quantity of hire that we're looking for. And the question I always ask myself is, if you know that talent is variable, which we do, wouldn't you just focus on trying to find the quality of the hires so that you could hire as few people as possible to do the most positive impact for the organization? And therefore, quality, in my opinion, has always trumped quantity. It's just in this moment, organizations do not have the ability to throw around quantity like they used to because they're being pressed for operational efficiency. They're being challenged by high interest rates, layoffs, economic uncertainty, Silicon Valley Bank, you name it, whatever's going on. And so they're saying, ooh, this once not precious asset, which was our ability to hire, is now becoming quite precious very quickly. And therefore, we're starting to learn things that psychologists have known for hundreds of years, which is people aren't interchangeable units and that talent exists and that it matters.
I think on that point, I'm curious to get your perspective on the assumption that I've heard a lot of times that the best performers don't currently work at the organization. I mean, call it the kind of the Amazon bar raising principle of every hire you make should be in the top 50% of your current performers. Now, if we think about quality of hire, and one of the things that a lot of people measure quality of hiring is retention. At what point does attrition actually become a net positive thing if you assume that the people that are leaving are worse than the people that you're hiring? I don't know if you have any perspective on to what part that plays in this decision to initially focus on maybe quantity of hire and now this shift back to quality.
Yeah, my last 2 organizations before joining Orgnostic were populated with a lot of ex-Amazon people. So I've heard a lot of this bar raiser talk before. It's like there's parts of it obviously that I agree with, and then there's parts of it that I think are pretty absurd, which is like at a certain point you're not going to be able to find anybody that's any higher on the bar. Like once you've hired Gandhi, you can't raise the bar above Gandhi. Like how are you going to do this? And and I think obviously this is going to be really controversial to say. The Amazon layoffs that are going on right now are indicative that there were flaws in this bar raiser methodology, because if it were actually working, they wouldn't be doing these layoffs, right? But that said, I think in principle, it's a really great practice to have, which is what they're kind of doing a roundabout way of getting at quality of hire. They're saying what we should be looking for is talent that is in the top 50th percentile of our current talent. And if we do this over and over and over again, much like kind of a stack ranking performance management system, we cut out the bottom and replace with the top. In theory, we should be having higher levels of talent. I I actually prefer to go with more of a research driven way of looking into this topic. So looking at things that are shown to improve retention, like the point you made earlier, that are shown to improve productivity, results, behaviors, performance, fit with the organization. I mean the positive fit, like PO fit, PJ fit. These are person organization fit, person job fit for those who aren't familiar with the literature, not things like cultural fit, which is more like, do you look like me, talk like me, act like me kind of stuff that's pretty unsavory. And then you're getting into areas that matter strictly to your organization. And this is why I put in that article that I wrote a long short framework, meaning from like stock trading. So you want to be long something, that means you want to keep it and hold it for a while, or you want to be short it because you think it's going to be poor. I'm actually short quality of hire definitions because everybody's got a different definition. What I am long is quality of hire frameworks. How can your organization build something that is tailored to understand the quality of the people that are bringing in for your company? And a really easy way of thinking about this is chances are the way you measure performance at your organization is different than your competitors. If that's the case, and you want to know who's performing better than others via a quality of hire measure, you're probably going to have a different definition than the company down the road from you.
I think that's pretty clear then. So we're thinking frameworks. What actually are we trying to measure, and how does that relate to, I think, taking one step further, the business goals, the business objectives, rather than a standalone metric that we may or may not have control over. What kind of factors do you think are going to be at play then? If you're thinking about the framework, there's things that we can measure. There's performance reviews. There's 90-day reviews. There's 3-month attrition, 6-month attrition, 12-month attrition. There's your GPA if you want to be aggressive and assume that actually plays a part in how successful someone is, which I've never seen any data that supports that. How would you think about them building a framework that is universal?
Well, I wouldn't build a universal framework. That's probably the start of it. But I'll go even a little bit upstream from that, which is, why should you measure quality of hire? It's to answer the question that executives and most hiring managers want to know, which is, are the people we hired better than what we expected? And so I take this framework of, you have an expected value versus an actual value of quality of hire, right? The expected value is what you wanted to see. The actual value is what you actually got, right? And the ways that you look into this from a framework perspective is, first of all, you need to understand how you're going to segment quality of hire amongst your business. Are you going to have the same definition for everyone that's hired? Or are you going to have a different definition for salaried employees versus hourly employees? Or there's a million different ways to segment your workforce. Are you going to have different definitions or the same definition? The next are there going to be components to your quality of hire definition that are subjective in nature or objective in nature? So objective would be an example, like, let's say you're hiring sales folks. Did they meet their 90-day quota? That's an objective number. Either yes, no, we met it, or did not meet it. Or is it going to be subjective in nature, like asking the new hires manager, how much do you think this, or how well do you think this person is performing on a scale of 1 to 10 or something like that? That's a subjective measure. And then the next level, and by the way, you can feel free to cut me off at any point, because I know that there's many more steps to this framework. The next is individual or aggregate, meaning, are you trying to measure the quality of Chris when he enters the organization, or are you trying to measure all of the Chris's that come in all at once via some kind of cohort or function or segment that I mentioned earlier, right? Or are you trying to do both? I mean, then there's things, and this gets to your point about performance appraisal, is the work direct work or indirect work? Can you show tangibly that a person stocking the shelves at a store stock them appropriately, that there's a direct impact of that? Or are you looking at the person's manager of the people who are stocking the shelves? Well, they're managing those employees. They're indirectly affecting their ability to stock the shelves appropriately, but they're not actually stocking themselves, right? And then there's the time period. Is it a week? Is it a month? Is it 90 days? Is it 1 year? And again, if you're using different segments of the organization, chances are you're going to have different time periods for different segments of the organization that you're thinking about. And then the last and probably most important, arguably, aspect is accuracy. How much does it matter if this is, and this is meant to be a pun, how much does it matter if it's directionally correct or if it has to be to the third decimal point, accuracy on how you're measuring something? I've worked at engineering organizations where things always had to be to the third decimal point, and I've worked at other places where it just mattered to know, are our employees doing better at the 90-day time frame than they were 2 quarters ago, and it was just directional in nature. And so I'll pause there. How do you react to that, Chris?
Yeah, I mean, I think you've kind of laid out a good framework that I think people could take and apply based on the kind of teams they're hiring for or the teams that you're measuring. There's going to be differences in what the expectations are, but I also wonder you've laid out a clear framework, but to what extent, if you go back to the subjective versus objective, to what extent are you actually stack ranking employees and new hires against existing employees? We mentioned the kind of bar raiser philosophy of 50% of every new hire has to be better than 50% of the kind of existing cohort. So are you truly measuring objective performance, or is there a place for that kind of subjective? And then to what extent do you measure quality of hire based on the performance of existing employees? And quota was an example that you gave. To what extent do you know whether the quota is actually reasonable, achievable? Do you actually measure whether someone hit the quota or not, or the percentage of quota they hit compared to their peers in their cohort? Do you think that there is a crossover between kind of current employees and new hires, and to what extent do those two intersect? And is it even fair to make that measurement?
Well, ultimately, questions of fairness, kind of to make it as simple as are adjudicated as what was expected of me and was it fair in comparison to how I performed adequately or inadequately, right? And there was a lot baked in there. I think the premise of it comes down to what matters to your organization, Chris. And so what I mean by that is, if you're taking just to use one tangible example based on something you were saying, is if you're taking a cohort-based approach to everyone who's been hired in the last 90 days in a sales organization, and all of their quotas are determined using the same methodology, which is presumably fair just for the sake of argument, then if one particular employee doesn't perform well and another one does perform well, that from a procedural justice standpoint, they had an adequate procedure for giving a fair outcome there. Now, let's play the alternative, which is, let's just say they were giving out quotas passing out or randomly giving people targets. Well, obviously, on face value, that's probably not a good way of setting quotas, first of all. But second of all, it's not very fair. And third of all, it's going to corrupt the measurement of something like quality of hire. And therefore, it couldn't be trusted because the criteria that's going into the measurement is flawed on its face value.
I think that's fair. And I think maybe one of the kind of the big arguments against measuring quality of hire, or even the ownership of quality of hire, which is something I do want to get to, is
let's talk about it. I have really strong feelings about this.
The ability to actually influence the quality. You said, at what point are you going to measure quality of hire? And I think the quickest turnaround time that my team were able to measure it was at the 3 months kind of 90-day performance review point. Mm-hmm. But I'd argue that the data by that point is pretty poor. You have a 90-day performance review where almost everyone is receiving a meets expectation, and attrition rate's so low that you're actually not really getting meaningful data to really drive changes in the recruiting process. Whereas 12 months down the road, when you have a little bit more data, even arguably still not enough, you're then at that point not really able to really change a lot, especially in a world where recruiter attrition is in mid figures. So to what extent do you think quality of hire can actually be measured before the hire is made, and how would you think about doing that? I have opinions and things that we've tested,
Yeah.
but without layering in too much bias, that's where one of the big challenges comes in. How would you
I
think
think
about that?
by my definition, I don't think it's possible to measure quality of hire before someone is hired, because that's ultimately a lagging indicator. That said, you could find leading indicators of quality of hire and try using some kind of probabilistic model, build out a way of scoring someone. That's entirely possible. Now, all the caveats aside about bias and accuracy, and is this legally defensible? All the things that you would normally do. Have you done a criterion related validity study? Yada yada yada. But it is possible to do. I just wouldn't call that quality of hire. I would call that a leading indicator of it. The point about is it 90 days or is it 1 year? I really come back to the reason why quality of hire is most of the time not assessed. There's like really practical reasons, like it's easier to count the number of human beings that are hired, and that's why quantity of hire is measured more often. But I would say it's because there's an aversion to accountability, right? If we don't measure quality of hire, nobody's accountable if people are bringing in poor talent. No one's accountable. And if we started measuring it, then we might have to become accountable to that. And we're not going to like that. Perhaps we are bringing accountability into an area that isn't used to having it. And people don't like it when you have accountability, right? And so I have so many thoughts on this, but that's why in the article I wrote about, it's really important to have a purpose of why you're measuring it, and then the intended outcomes of what you're going to do with it. Therefore, if your purpose is to bring, let's say, for the sake of argument, accountability to your recruiting function for the talent they're bringing into an organization, and then the intended outcomes are we're actually going to give every recruiter a score on their average quality that they've brought in, and they have a number that they are like they need a threshold that they need to meet. And if they're not meeting that threshold, maybe they are going on some kind of performance improvement plan or something like that. I'm not suggesting this is the way you should go about doing it. I'm saying it is, if that's the purpose and intended outcomes of how you intend to use this, then that's going to dictate how you measure quality of hire as well. Right. But if you're waiting a year, it's probably a difficult thing to measure, recruiter effectiveness. However, it may be a great way of measuring, because I've seen quality of hire used as a leading indicator for things like high potential programs. Well, if you wait a year, maybe that's probably a really great indicator, right? But if you're only doing it after 90 days, it's probably not a great indicator of high potential. And so again, it really matters what your purpose and intended outcomes are. What are the variables you're putting into the actual calculation? Who's accountable? How it's being tracked over time? And what are the results of when you make changes based on it? Right? Because ultimately, if you have a objective way of measuring quality of hire, you should then therefore be able to put in initiatives to improve it. And then you should be able to measure the consequence of those initiatives to see if they actually do improve it or not improve it. And if you use a lagging indicator that's a year in, it's going to take you a year before you find out if the initiatives you put in place are actually improving quality of hire. So there are trade-offs.
Got it. And so I'm going to give you a hypothetical situation that may or may not be based on a real life scenario. So
It's a real
let's say
life
that
scenario. He's
let's say you're
putting his
supporting
hand.
a large engineering team that is trying to upskill the organization. They're trying to build what they're calling a tier one engineering capability. And they believe to do that, they're going to have to go external for that. So quality of hire now becomes the number one metric.
Mm-hmm.
Where does the ownership for improving that metric and ensuring that tier one hires are the only hires being made for the engineering organization?
Well, first of all, we'd have to figure out what tier one is. I'm not familiar with this term, and I'm sure it's probably quite subjective in its own right, but that's another conversation for another day. I think about when it comes back to the purpose and intended outcomes, think of it like a RACI chart. Who's responsible, who's accountable, who's consulted, who's informed. Like, who is responsible for this? Is it the recruiter? Is it the hiring manager? Is it the engineering team? Like, I've been a part of organizations that only hire via like these panel type interviews, right? Well, then it's probably the panel interview who is ultimately accountable for improving this, and is hand is slapped if they're not doing a good job bringing in whatever tier one engineers are. And then if because again, we're going back to organizational segments, it sounds like the segment that matters the most is this engineering organization. And because, as a consequence of that, we're going to create a very tailored quality of hire definition. And chances are you're not going to find out whether someone is a tier one hire in engineering after 2 weeks. So you're probably going to have a longer period of time before that's determined. You're probably going to be doing a lot of these things on an individual basis rather than an aggregate basis, because there's probably not large enough sample sizes to do aggregate measures. Because one of the things about aggregate measures is you want to have a large number of multi-incumbent roles. So many people doing the exact same job. Depending on the size of the engineering team, it's going to dictate whether you could do that or not. And it's probably going to be skewed towards objective data about these teams. But there's probably, because again, who knows what tier one means, probably a large subjective component to it as well. And because engineering work, likely, I don't know what they're building, but let's say they're building a website or a product, a lot of that work is going to be measured via direct work, because you can see someone be able to do the work, and then you're going to be able to see the output of that work put into play from a UX standpoint or from a throughput standpoint. I don't know exactly what they would be doing, but it should be very direct in nature. So I think we've covered all the bases of the hypothetical situation pretty well there, Chris.
Yeah, so that's I think I agree with all of your points, and I think one of the things that we've maybe touched on is the breadth of people that are actually involved in driving quality of hire. And I always like to have one single responsible owner for a metric. In this case, I would argue the recruiting team should own the metric, but that's not to say that the outcome is not going to be driven by many other people. And so Pamela asked a really interesting related question: is how appropriate is it to also build in accountability for the hiring manager and the team for onboarding and on-ramp? You've put yourself in the recruiter's shoes. They've gone through this, they've gone through the wars to try and get this team hired, and then they hand them over to the hiring team to onboard and ramp. To what extent are they accountable to the quality of hire metric, and where does that fall?
Absolutely. I think accountability should lie closest to the person who has the skin in the game. All right. So if a recruiter didn't make a hire, no hire decision, how can they ultimately be accountable to the quality of that hire? Now, they are accountable for the people that are put on the buffet to choose from, right? They aren't necessarily accountable if the hiring manager made the go, no go decision. They should be accountable to who is hired or not. Similarly, to your point on onboarding, which is a really valid point, by the way. If the team is having kind of like, I just think about it like the metaphorical, school table at cafeteria at lunch, and if nobody's inviting the person to like sit at the table who's a new hire from the team, and they're probably going to quit pretty soon because they're not being included. And that's one of the things that I say from a research-based standpoint does show a relationship to quality of hire is inclusion and things like this. And so there are things that you can do that are very objective in nature, like productivity oriented measures, but also very subjective in nature, like was I onboarded in a way that made me feel included, that do matter in relationship to quality of hire and who's accountable for that.
I think that's a really great comment to end on here. I could talk about this for hours and hours, but I promised you it would only be 30 minutes. So I'm going to jump into the comments after this session and hopefully engage and answer some more questions. But before we drop, Cole, I'd love to give you the chance to plug anything else that's going on in your world with Orgnostic, with Directionally Correct, anything else you've got in the works.
Absolutely. follow Sonar Talent. They're doing great work. If you are interested in learning more about how to put quality of hire into production, my organization, Orgnostic, has a way of doing this using our employee lifecycle analytics. That's pretty progressive and interesting, and will really help raise the productivity of an HR function. Listen to Directionally Correct. We have really good conversations. Usually not as informative as the conversation we're having right now. So this has been great, Chris. But yeah, thanks so much for having me. And please be on the lookout for what Sonar Talent is doing. They're doing big things.
I appreciate that plug. Thanks, Cole.